Have you ever wondered what would happen if a forgotten man walked into a place built on power and dared to say, "This was mine"? What if he held a secret buried for over half a century and carried it in nothing more than an old canvas bag? Now imagine you're standing in line at a Chase Bank on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day when time moves slowly and everyone seems to just want to get through the motions. Deposit checks apply for a loan move on. The marble floors are clean. The air smells like fresh coffee and disinfectant. And suddenly, the front doors creak open. He steps in, old, black, alone, wearing a tattered coat held together by patches and memory, shoes so worn you wonder how they're still holding up, and slung over his shoulder a bag, faded, frayed, heavy with time. People turn, some stare. A young man in a suit lets out a chuckle. A woman clutches her purse tighter. The security guard shifts his stance, already annoyed. And then in the middle of the lobby, the old man speaks, softly, calmly, but every word slices through the stillness like a blade. "This bank is mine." There's a pause, and then laughter, echoing, rising, falling. Some cruel, some just confused. But no one knew that behind the wrinkles, behind the silence, behind the strange claim, was a truth so powerful it could bring an empire to its knees. In today's story, you'll meet a man who had every reason to disappear but chose to return. A man who held on to hope not out of naivety, but out of purpose. And when the world laughed at him, he stood still because he knew what they didn't. What you're about to hear is not just a story about a bank. It's a story about memory, betrayal, injustice, and what it means to be seen again after a lifetime of being erased. Because sometimes justice comes walking in wearing worn-out shoes. So stay with us because in the next few minutes, you'll witness something extraordinary. How a single sentence spoken by an old man cracked the marble floors beneath Chase Bank. Let's begin with the moment everyone looked away and the one man who refused to. On that chilly Tuesday afternoon, no one expected their routine day at the bank to change. The teller was finishing a latte behind the counter. A teenager in a hoodie scrolled through his phone, waiting for his mother to finish filling out a form. And in the corner, a middle-aged couple argued softly over which savings plan made more sense. It was by every measure an ordinary day, until the front doors creaked open and he walked in. The man was elderly, thin, and carried himself slowly, but with a strange, quiet dignity. His coat was old, heavy-patched, and stained with time. His shoes were so worn down the soles had begun to fray at the edges. One of the laces had snapped and been tied back together like it had happened years ago and never been replaced. And slung over his shoulder was a bag canvas, faded, weighed down by something inside. The kind of bag people stopped using decades ago. No one said anything, but reactions speak louder than words. The room shifted. A young bank employee leaned toward his colleague and whispered with a smirk, "Homeless guy. Probably wandered in by mistake." His colleague chuckled. "Maybe he thinks this is the welfare office." A few feet away, a well-dressed woman in her 40s tightened her grip on her designer purse. Her eyes flicked toward the man, then toward the guard as if expecting someone to handle it. And behind the glass doors of his private office, the bank manager glanced up, annoyed by the sudden murmurs spreading through the lobby. No one asked who the man was. No one asked why he was there. They just assumed, because he didn't look like someone who belonged in that space. Not in a Chase Bank, not in a neighborhood like Rockview, and certainly not in a lobby lined with marble floors and crisp suits. But Elijah Kirby wasn't confused. He didn't come in asking for help. He walked slowly, deliberately to the center of the room, and in a voice not loud but unmistakably clear, he said, "This bank is mine." At first there was silence. Then, as if on cue, the laughter began. Some polite and awkward, some sharp and cruel. No one took him seriously. They saw an old black man in a ragged coat making an outrageous claim, and they wrote him off as delusional or worse, a disturbance. But what no one asked themselves was this: what if he wasn't joking? You see, we all do it. We're quick to judge, especially when someone looks like they don't fit the setting. We assume someone's value based on how they dress, how they speak, how old they are, or where they're from. And sometimes, just sometimes, we laugh too soon before realizing what we're laughing at. It's a mistake rooted not just in ignorance, but in something deeper, the comfort of not having to care. Because if we don't have to take someone seriously, we don't have to listen. And if we don't listen, we don't have to confront what makes us uncomfortable. That day, everyone in that bank was comfortable until Elijah spoke. Until he dared to claim something none of them believed he could possibly own. Not with his coat, not with his skin, not with his silence. But the truth doesn't need a nice suit. And justice doesn't always come dressed like a CEO. Sometimes it enters the room quietly, with cracked soles and a canvas bag. And while everyone was still laughing, Elijah slowly began to open his bag. Because, while the world was busy underestimating him, he had come prepared. The moment Elijah's voice echoed through the marble hall, the security guard stepped forward. His name was Stephen Miller, tall, broad-shouldered, crisp uniform, and a face that had forgotten how to smile years ago. Stephen had worked this post for over a decade. To him, order was everything, and order meant control. So when he saw the old man in ragged clothes standing in the center of the bank, making what sounded like a ridiculous claim, he didn't see a customer. He saw a problem. Stephen's hand rested lightly on the holster at his hip. A subtle message. Not quite a threat, but not exactly subtle either. He didn't yell, he didn't shout, but his tone said it all. "Sir," he said firmly, "you need to leave. Now, this isn't a shelter." There it was. That single sentence carried more than just authority. It carried something heavier, something colder, assumption. The assumption that Elijah was out of place, that he didn't belong, that he was a threat simply because he existed where he wasn't expected to be. And behind Stephen's words, a silent chorus of agreement seemed to ripple through the room. The way a woman adjusted her purse, the way a man rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath, the way the tellers behind the counter paused what they were doing but didn't step in. They had all decided who Elijah was, without asking, without wondering, without even listening. But Elijah didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't protest. He simply looked Stephen in the eye and said calmly, but with a quiet force, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to reclaim what was stolen from me. This bank was mine." Silence. This wasn't the voice of a man ranting nonsense. This wasn't the tone of someone lost or confused. It was the voice of a man who had waited a long, long time to be heard. Here's the thing about prejudice. It rarely shows up as shouting or violence at first. It whispers. It assumes. It shows itself in glances and posture in the space people don't give you. And dignity is what you hold on to when the world tries to strip it away. It's not loud. It doesn't fight back with fists. It just stands, quietly, resiliently. That's what Elijah did. And in that moment, even Stephen Miller, the seasoned guard with the rigid jawline and unbending stance, hesitated. Just for a second. Because there was something unsettling about how calm Elijah was. Something certain. Across the room behind his desk, the bank manager, James Temp, had been watching everything unfold. James was a numbers man, polished, composed, and efficient. But he'd seen enough to know this wasn't just a misunderstanding. So he stepped out from behind the counter and approached the two men. Sir James said smoothly, "Perhaps you're mistaken. This bank has been in the Matthews family for generations. Are you sure you're not confusing it with another?" But Elijah didn't break eye contact. He didn't blink. "I'm not mistaken," he replied, "and I have the records to prove it." And slowly, deliberately, he placed the worn canvas bag on the floor in front of him. The room tensed again. What could possibly be in that bag? We often talk about dignity, like it's something abstract, something reserved for speeches and textbooks. But in that moment, dignity looked like an old man, with worn-out shoes and a spine that refused to bend. It looked like calm in the face of suspicion. It looked like clarity surrounded by noise and prejudice. It looked like Stephen's hand still hovering too close to his holster. It looked like the side eyes from people who had already decided what was true before they ever heard the facts. But that was about to change. Because as Elijah reached down to open his bag, the room that once laughed began to listen. The room had quieted. The mocking whispers had faded. Even Stephen Miller, still holding his stance, was no longer quite so sure of himself. All eyes followed Elijah's hands as they reached down, tired, weathered hands that had once built something out of nothing, now slowly pulling at the strings of a worn canvas bag. You could hear the faint rustle of fabric, the creak of old leather straining under the years. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't showy, but somehow it felt sacred. Piece by piece, the contents of the bag came into view. Not weapons, not trash, not the wandering possessions of a man lost to time, but documents. Stacks of papers, some yellowed, some brittle at the corners, bound carefully in oilskin and string. And at the very top, a ledger. A large hand-bound book with a cracked spine and the faded words barely legible on its cover, Chase Bank. Ledger 1948. There was a collective intake of breath. James Temp took an involuntary step forward. Stephen's fingers twitched slightly at his side. And somewhere near the back of the lobby, a customer instinctively raised their phone to start recording. Elijah stood up again, the ledger in his hands. He didn't lift it high like a trophy. He held it the way a father might hold an old family photo, reverently, protectively. This, he said quietly, is where it all began. This is the first record of the bank I built with my own hands, my own money, and my own hope. And for the first time since he walked through those doors, no one laughed. Because this wasn't just a story anymore. This was evidence. This was something real. He gently laid the ledger on the nearest table, opened it, and flipped through its pages with surprising precision, like someone who had done this many times before. Names, transactions, original signatures, and then he pointed to a line near the top of a page, founder Elijah C.K. Kirby, and beneath it co-founder Johnny Williams. James leaned in, eyes narrowing, brow furrowed. It was unmistakable. The handwriting, the ink, the old bank seal embossed in the corner. I haven't seen a book like this in decades, he murmured, not denying it, not yet believing it, but shaken deeply. Elijah went on, his voice steady. In 1948, I founded this bank. It wasn't called Chase back then. It was just a small institution for working folks. People like me. People who couldn't get loans from the big banks because of their skin, their status, or their name. He paused for a moment, glancing around the room. We served the farmers, the mechanics, the single mothers, and we did it with fairness. But when the bank started doing well, the world outside didn't like that a black man was the one behind the desk. So they started writing me out. Quietly, efficiently. Here's what most people don't realize: erasure doesn't always come violently. Sometimes it comes with paperwork, with altered records, with meetings behind closed doors. You don't need to burn someone's legacy, you just need to overwrite it. That's what happened to Elijah. Slowly, deliberately, they took the name off the door, then off the records, and eventually off the memory of everyone in Rockview. Except his, because Elijah remembered. And more importantly, he kept the proof. There's a lesson here. Sometimes the people we dismiss as forgotten or irrelevant are the ones who've remembered everything. Not because they're stuck in the past, but because the past is still stuck in the present. That bag didn't just carry old papers. It carried grief. It carried betrayal. It carried a fight Elijah had been forced to carry alone for most of his life. And now he was putting it all on the table. The atmosphere in the bank had changed. People weren't just watching out of curiosity anymore. They were watching because something inside them had shifted. A few customers, who had clutched their belongings earlier, now looked uneasy, not with fear, but with guilt. And James. He didn't know it yet, but the foundation of everything he believed about the bank he ran was about to be shaken hard. Because what Elijah was revealing wasn't just his story, it was a truth too long ignored. Elijah's finger rested gently beneath the name printed just below his own, Johnny Williams, the co-founder, his former partner, and the man who would in time erase Elijah from the very institution they had built together. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. But in the silence of that marble lobby, every word he spoke landed like a quiet thunder. John and I built this place from nothing. He began. We were young, ambitious, tired of being told no, especially when we knew what we were capable of. He handled the legal side. I handled the people. Together, we made it work. He paused for a second, glancing at the stunned faces around him, and then he added softly, "And I trusted him like a brother." That's the part that always hurts most, isn't it? Not the theft, not the betrayal, but the fact that it came from someone you once believed in. Elijah went on to describe how the early days of the bank were filled with hope, how they welcomed customers turned away by other banks, black farmers, immigrants, war veterans, people who had been told they didn't qualify. Back then, their bank wasn't much: 2 rooms, a hand-painted sign, and a steel safe that clanked when you shut it. But it was honest. It was growing. And that made it dangerous. Because a successful bank led by a black man in 1948, that wasn't something Rockview or the powers that shaped it were ready for. That's when things changed, Elijah continued. John started showing up to meetings late. He started taking calls I wasn't invited to. And then he brought in the Matthews family. The room stirred at the name. Even James Temp shifted uncomfortably. Everyone in Rockview knew the Matthews name. They had run Chase Bank for generations. Philanthropists, political donors, local royalty. But few knew where that legacy had begun. Even fewer wanted to ask. Elijah explained how legal paperwork began to move behind closed doors. Documents he was never shown, contracts he was told were just formalities. And one day when he showed up to work, his nameplate was gone. Not broken, not scratched out, just gone. He tried to fight it. He hired a lawyer, brought evidence, testified. But back then, Elijah said, you could walk into a courtroom with every fact on your side and still be told you didn't belong there. Here's the painful truth: power doesn't need to scream. It just whispers into the right ears, in the right rooms with the right signatures. And then it rewrites history. It puts plaques on walls. It names buildings after the people who stayed in the room. And it erases the ones who were pushed out. That's how Elijah Kirby became a footnote no one remembered, while John E. Williams and the Matthews family built an empire on his foundation. If this sounds unbelievable, you only need to look at the countless stories like Elijah's that never got told. The black veterans denied home loans under the GI Bill, the indigenous communities whose land deeds were rewritten, the women inventors whose patents were filed under men's names. History is not always a lie, but it is often selective. And those who hold the pen decide which parts are worth keeping. When you don't control the narrative, someone else will write your story for you. And they won't always get it right. Sometimes they won't even try. Back in the lobby, Elijah gently closed the ledger. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way people expected. He was steady, grounded, because he knew the most powerful thing in the room that day wasn't the vault, wasn't the manager, wasn't even the threat of a security guard with a hand near his holster. It was the truth, and it had finally found its voice. And so, with eyes now watching him differently, less with doubt, more with quiet recognition, Elijah reached into the bag again. This time not for names, but for the evidence of the erasure itself. When Elijah opened the second bundle from his canvas bag, the room leaned in once more. This wasn't just history, now it was testimony. He unwrapped a set of old court documents, faded petitions, rejection letters, even transcripts from hearings that had long been forgotten by everyone, except him. These, Elijah said, holding up one of the yellowing pages, are the records of every courtroom I ever stepped into where I tried to fight to get my name back. His voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. But somehow it still cut through the air sharper than any gavel ever had. Back then, Elijah believed in the system. He believed that if he had proof, contracts, witness statements, receipts, then surely someone would listen. He filed the paperwork. He waited in lines. He put on the one good suit he owned, borrowed from a neighbor, and walked into those courtrooms with hope in his chest and evidence in hand. But time after time, the answer was always the same: insufficient grounds, outside the statute of limitations, no legal precedent, or sometimes no explanation at all. Just a clerk who looked through him, a judge who never met his eyes, a courtroom full of empty seats where justice never sat down. It wasn't just about the law, it was about where the law refused to go. At the time, black business owners were still seen as exceptions, not examples. Their success was treated with suspicion, not respect. And Elijah, he wasn't just a man asking for property, he was a man asking for power, and that made him dangerous. He shared a moment that had never left him. One judge, Elijah, said, his eyes far away, looked me right in the eye and said, "Son, even if you did start the bank, what makes you think you were ever meant to keep it?" Gasps rippled through the room, not loud, but unmistakable, because that's what prejudice looks like when it wears a robe and sits behind a bench. And Elijah, He walked out of that courthouse with his dignity dented but not destroyed. He didn't give up. He simply ran out of places to knock on. Here's the thing about walls. They don't always rise out of the ground. Sometimes they're built out of silence, out of locked doors, out of sorry there's nothing we can do. But walls built on injustice don't last forever. Not when someone refuses to stop knocking. There's a story, maybe you've heard it, about Henrietta Lacks, a black woman whose cells were taken without consent and used in medical breakthroughs for decades. No credit, no compensation, no recognition until her family stood up and demanded the world remember her name. Or Claudette Colvin, the teenager, who refused to give up her bus seat months before Rosa Parks, but was written out of history because she was considered too young, too dark, too poor. These stories matter because they show us something important. Erasure is never accidental. It is chosen, just as justice when it comes is chosen too. Elijah looked around the bank lobby where not long ago people had been laughing at him. Now they watched in stillness, some with shame, some with awe. Even James Temp, the manager, stood motionless, his hands clutching the old court files like they were burning through his skin. Because they didn't just tell a story, they exposed a system. Justice delayed isn't just justice denied, it's justice buried. And someone has to be willing to dig it up. That someone in this story was Elijah. And what he was about to reveal next wasn't about lawyers or judges anymore. It was about the unexpected allies who would change everything. When truth met courage. The bank lobby was quiet now, not silent because people didn't care, but silent because they were finally listening. Elijah stood still, the weight of 5 decades resting in his hands laid bare through papers. No one had seen through truths. No one had dared to name. And then something unexpected happened. From behind the teller counter, a young woman stepped forward. Her name was Emily Carter, 26, fresh out of college. The kind of employee who normally kept her head down, her words, careful, her presence almost invisible in a room full of older men in suits. But today she stepped into the light. Her hands trembled slightly as she bent down to pick up one of the old faded bills Elijah had laid out. She turned it over in her fingers gently, almost reverently, and then walked toward the table where the ledger sat. And without saying much, she placed the bill beside it. Then she looked up. "I believe you, Mr. Kirby," she said, her voice soft but sure. "And I think it's time we stop pretending we don't." There it was, the first crack in the wall. Not made by force, but by courage. A small act, a quiet act. But in a world trained to look the other way, that kind of truth is loud. And just like that, Emily's bravery began to spread. One by one, the others followed. Josh, the teller, who'd laughed earlier, stepped forward next, his face flushed with embarrassment, but his hands steady. I'm sorry," he said. "I judged you before you even spoke. I didn't know. I never even thought to ask." He placed another bill next to Emily's, then Martin, then Julia, then the assistant manager. Each of them said nothing more than a few words, but their actions spoke for them. They were no longer just employees in a bank. They were witnesses, and finally participants in something far bigger than transactions and balance sheets. Here's the truth about truth itself. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need an army. It just needs someone, anyone, to stop being silent long enough to let it in. In every generation, it's usually the young, the overlooked, the underestimated, who lead the charge when old systems start to crack. Think of the Greensboro 4 students who staged sit-ins during the Civil Rights Movement. Or Malala Yousafzai, who spoke up for girls' education when the world told her to be quiet. It starts with one voice, then two, then a tide. And that's exactly what began inside Chase Bank that day. As more employees stepped forward, something else changed. The air in the room, once thick with doubt and defensiveness, felt different, lighter, like a weight had been lifted. Even Stephen Miller, the security guard who had kept his hand near his weapon for most of the confrontation, looked shaken. Not angry, not ready to surrender, but uncertain. His world had been built on rules, and Elijah Kirby had just rewritten them with nothing more than a voice in the truth. Sometimes the strongest stand isn't loud, it's quiet, it's simple. It's one person doing the right thing first. Because when truth finally walks through the door, it doesn't come with banners or fanfare. It comes in the form of people brave enough to stop pretending. And while Elijah stood watching this quiet wave of change ripple through the lobby, He knew the hardest part was still ahead. Because if telling the truth was difficult, standing between it and a man with a gun would take even more. For a long moment, the room held its breath. Old documents lay on the table like quiet witnesses. Employees stood behind them like pillars of truth. And in the center of it all, Elijah Kirby still calm, still upright, still unbroken. But near the back of the room, one man wasn't ready to let go. Stephen Miller, the security guard, stood rigid. His face was flushed, not from heat, but from something more dangerous, pride colliding with doubt. He had watched the shift happening all around him. He'd seen the manager hesitate, the staff step forward, the laughter turn into silence. And to Stephen, it felt like the world had turned upside down. Because for years, he believed he was the one protecting the bank, protecting order, protecting the rules. And now those rules were slipping through his fingers, replaced by questions he didn't want to answer. His hand moved again, back to the holster on his side, slow, deliberate, and this time he unlatched it. The metallic click echoed louder than any voice had that day. Every head turned, every breath caught, even James' temp froze in place. Stephen's voice, when it came, trembled beneath its own weight. "This has gone far enough," he said. "This man is causing a disturbance. These documents, anyone could fake this stuff. I'm not going to let him ruin this place." His fingers curled around the grip of the gun, not drawn, but no longer idle. And across the room, Elijah met his eyes. Not with anger, not with fear, but with a steady, heartbreaking calm. "Mr. Miller," he said gently, "I'm not here to ruin anything. I'm here to remind you what was ruined and never made right. Here's what no one tells you about power. When it's built on fear, it becomes fragile. And when someone challenges it with truth, it trembles." Stephen wasn't evil. He wasn't cruel. He was scared. Because if Elijah was right, then Stephen hadn't been protecting justice all these years. He'd been guarding the door against it. At that moment, James Temp did something no one expected. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and he placed himself physically between Elijah and Stephen. His voice was calm but firm. "Stephen, put the gun down," he said. "This isn't who we are, and this isn't how we fix anything." The whole room was still. Stephen's hand stayed frozen. "Look around," James continued. "You think he's alone? Look again. Look at your colleagues. Look at me. We're not standing against you, we're standing with what's right." And then something remarkable happened. Stephen's hand trembled, just slightly, but enough. Enough to feel the weight of everything he'd believed begin to crack. He looked down at the gun, then at Elijah, then at the bank around him, the one he thought he was protecting from chaos, but had never truly understood. Finally, with a breath that sounded like surrender, he let the gun fall back into the holster and took a step back, a step away from fear, a step toward truth. Sometimes conscience speaks loudest not in a shout, but in the quiet decision to stop being wrong. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to step out of the way and let justice pass through. Stephen didn't say anything else, but his silence said enough. And for the first time in that long, heavy afternoon, Elijah exhaled. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because while the lobby had chosen to listen, the most powerful names, the ones hidden behind boardroom doors, hadn't yet been confronted. And James Temp, he was about to make the hardest decision of his life. For a moment, the air inside the bank felt still, not heavy, not tense, just still, like a storm had passed through, and everyone was waiting to see what remained standing. Elijah stood quietly beside the table, the old ledger open, the documents laid out, the faded currency still fluttering slightly beneath the breeze of the central air. And across from him stood James Temp, the bank manager, the man trained to control outcomes, to predict trends, to keep the brand polished and the investors confident. He had built his career on numbers, policies, and narratives. But today, the story he had always believed about this bank, the one passed down in manuals and framed photographs, was unraveling. James stared at the signatures in the ledger again, at the business filings dated back to 1948, at the original ownership agreements with Elijah Kirby's name clearly marked as founder, and then at the stack of legal documents, none of which included Elijah's signature on the transfer of ownership, only the Matthews families and Johnny Williams. James felt his stomach turn. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It wasn't a baseless accusation. It was right there on paper. And the truth he realized had never really been gone. It had just been buried beneath the comfort of not asking too many questions. He looked up, meeting Elijah's gaze. There was no anger in the old man's eyes, no demand, just a deep, almost haunting knowing. Like he had waited for this look of realization his entire life. And now that it had arrived, he wasn't celebrating. He was simply ready. James stepped back, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. He had grown up in Rockview, attended dinners at the Matthews estate, started his first internship at this very bank, mentored by men who bore the Matthews name with pride. They were the ones who gave him his start, and now they were the ones who, knowingly or not, had built that legacy on stolen foundation. And the truth, it wasn't just uncomfortable, it was radioactive, because exposing it would mean more than facing public scrutiny. It could mean lawsuits, loss of reputation, backlash from powerful families who had shaped the economy of the entire region. James could already imagine the emails, the boardroom whispers, the articles. But then he looked around again. He saw Emily, who had spoken up first. He saw Josh standing a little taller now next to the ledger he once mocked. He saw Stephen, still quiet but no longer blocking the way. And then he saw Elijah, not as a threat, not as a disturbance, but as a man who had been telling the truth for 50 years and was only just now being heard. Here's the hard part about truth. It doesn't care who it inconveniences. It doesn't care how long it's been ignored. It just waits. And when it finally surfaces, it demands a response. James took a breath, then another. And then he did what few men in power are ever taught to do. He admitted it. Out loud. "Mr. Kirby," he said, "you're right. This bank was taken from you. And I've seen enough to know we can't hide that anymore." A quiet gasp, a soft exhale. Someone in the back let out a whispered, "Wow." Because in that moment, a man who had everything to lose chose to stand for something bigger than his title. History can be edited. Stories can be rewritten. But the truth, when it's real, doesn't go away. It stays buried beneath the noise until someone has the courage to dig it up. James looked at his staff, then back at Elijah. And with a firm but shaken voice, he said, "I'm calling the board. They need to see all of this. No more hiding. Not from them, not from the public, not from ourselves." Elijah didn't smile. He simply nodded, not out of victory, but out of recognition. After all this time, someone had finally seen him. But James knew this was only the beginning, because telling the truth is one thing. Standing by it in the face of power is another. And the Matthews family, they wouldn't go quietly. No gavel had struck. No judge sat behind a bench. And yet justice had entered the room. The moment James Temp admitted the truth, something invisible but powerful began to shift. The polished marble lobby of Chase Bank, once just a place for withdrawals and deposits, had turned into something else entirely. A courtroom without robes, a jury without summons, a trial of conscience held in the hearts of ordinary people. And the crowd, customers, employees, bystanders, became the court. It started small. A man near the entrance, maybe in his late 60s, pulled out his phone and began to record, not out of spectacle, but out of duty. A woman who had been clutching her handbag earlier now stepped forward, her expression soft. "I brought my children here to open their first savings account," she said. "They should know who really built this place." And one by one, others joined in. Voices that had once been silent out of doubt or discomfort now filled the room with quiet solidarity. Some said nothing, just nodded at Elijah with a respect deeper than words. Some approached the table, laying a hand on the old ledger, like it was sacred. Some simply cried, not loudly, not for attention, but because they realized they had witnessed something both historic and human. Here's the beautiful, complicated truth about people. We don't always get it right the first time. We judge too quickly, we assume, we stay silent. But when we are shown the truth clearly, undeniably, we can change. And in that lobby, that's exactly what was happening. Elijah hadn't just told his story, he had invited people into it. And by stepping forward, by acknowledging the past, the crowd wasn't just observing justice, they were becoming part of it. Think of the civil rights protests in Selma. It wasn't just the leaders who made the difference. It was the ordinary marchers, the churchgoers, The grocery clerks. They were the ones who, when history looked the other way, became the mirror it couldn't ignore. Or more recently, remember the cell phone footage that sparked a global movement. It wasn't filmed by a journalist, it was a teenager. Just someone who knew this isn't right. The power of collective conscience isn't theoretical. It's real, it's transformative. And on that day in that bank, it was alive. Even Stephen Miller, who had once stood ready to draw his weapon, now stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. His posture no longer rigid, his hand far from the holster, his gaze reflective. He hadn't said a word since stepping back, but the silence was no longer defensive. It was listening. And sometimes listening is where redemption begins. You don't have to wear a badge to protect what's right. You don't need a title to stand for truth. And you certainly don't need a courtroom to deliver justice. Sometimes the most powerful verdicts come not from law books, but from the people who choose in a single moment to see what was always there and say that matters. Elijah looked around the lobby, no longer filled with contempt, but with recognition. And for the first time, his face softened. Not because the fight was over, but because he finally knew he wouldn't have to fight it alone. Still, he understood something that not everyone in the room did just yet. There was one more confrontation left. The most powerful name had yet to speak, and the boardroom behind the bank's closed doors was about to feel the weight of everything they had worked so hard to keep buried. The next morning, James Temp stood in front of the Chase Bank Board of Directors. His hands carried everything Elijah had laid bare: the original ledger, the ownership contracts, the court records, and a simple truth wrapped in decades of silence. Across the long mahogany table sat members of the Matthews family, sharp suits, steeled expressions, eyes trained to control rooms like this one. They had built their name on success, on philanthropy, on legacy, but now that legacy was being held up to the light, and beneath the polish was a theft too large to deny. James cleared his throat. He was nervous, but something inside him, something quiet, something steady held him upright. "I know what I'm about to say puts everything on the line," he began, "but the truth deserves more than our convenience." He placed the documents on the table. This bank was founded by Elijah C.K. Kirby in 1948, and it was stolen through legal deception, racial prejudice, and silence. We've built decades of wealth and prestige on a story that was never ours to begin with. The room froze. Not a sound. Only the low hum of the overhead lights and the weight of history settling into the room. Some on the board immediately pushed back. "This is over 70 years ago. There's no way to prove ownership beyond dispute. Do you realize what this could do to the institution's reputation?" James listened. And then he replied, not with fire, but with truth. "The institution's reputation was already broken. We just refused to see the cracks." That's the thing about justice when it arrives late. It doesn't show up wearing armor. It doesn't march in with applause. It walks in slowly, quietly, sometimes dressed in a worn coat, carrying a canvas bag. But it walks in just the same. And when it does, you either welcome it in or let it pass you by forever. Outside the boardroom, word was spreading. Local news outlets began picking up the story. Community members, many who had forgotten Elijah's name or never knew it, began speaking his story aloud. Not as a rumor, not as a scandal, but as a long overdue truth. And Elijah, he didn't come back the next day or the next week because he had already done what he came to do. He didn't need applause. He didn't want a monument. All he ever wanted was to be remembered honestly. Back at the bank, something subtle but powerful began to change. James initiated an independent investigation. The bank committed to making a public acknowledgement. Staff received training not just on compliance, but on conscience. And on the wall near the lobby entrance, where once hung a photo of the Matthews family breaking ground on the building, there is now a plaque. Simple, unpolished. It reads, "In memory of Elijah C.K. Kirby, founder. Visionary, may the truth never be buried again." Here's the final lesson. Justice doesn't expire. It may wait. It may wander. It may be dismissed, mocked, or ignored. But when it walks in, it deserves a seat at the table. And those who choose to stand with it, no matter how late, choose to become part of a better story. Elijah Kirby walked into a bank one afternoon with nothing but a bag of name and the truth. He walked out not as a hero, not as a victim, but as a man finally seen. And in doing so, he reminded us all, it's never too late to be right. By the time Elijah stepped out into the late afternoon sun that day, the lobby behind him no longer felt like a bank. It felt like something sacred had just happened there. And in a way it had. Inside, James Temp remained still surrounded by papers that no longer felt like just documents, but like echoes of something the world had tried to forget. He knew what needed to come next, and he also knew it wouldn't be easy. The very next morning, James entered the Chase Bank boardroom. It was a room he had walked into dozens of times, polished table-crisp suits, voices that spoke in margins and market trends. But that day he walked in with something different. Not just a presentation, not a quarterly report, but a story. One the bank had never included in its brochures or press releases. One that could no longer be ignored. He laid out the evidence, the original ledger, the deeds, the missing signatures, the court transcripts, and the undeniable truth they all carried. The room was quiet at first. Then came the resistance. You realize what this would cost us. This is ancient history. There's no legal obligation to acknowledge any of this. James listened, but he didn't flinch. He simply said it may not be a legal obligation, but it's a moral one, and we've failed it for over 50 years. That's the thing about justice when it arrives late. It doesn't always show up with applause. It doesn't come with crowds cheering or doors flung open. Sometimes it comes slowly, quietly, wearing cracked shoes, carrying a bag full of papers, and standing with a heart that never gave up. And when it arrives, you either look away or you make room. Outside those boardroom doors, the story had already started to move. A local reporter had heard whispers. Emily Carter had quietly shared what happened on her blog. Within days, news outlets began picking it up. Black founder erased from history of local bankman. Claims ownership of Chase branch brings 1948. Ledger justice decades late. The story of Elijah Kirby. And for the first time, the community began to ask, not is it true, but how did we never know? Because that's how systemic injustice often works, not with sirens, but with silence. Not by destroying the truth, but by burying it under comfort, convenience, and time. But truth, as it turns out, is patient. And Elijah. He had waited long enough. He didn't need compensation. He didn't want revenge. He wasn't after a courtroom battle or public spotlight. All he wanted was acknowledgement, to be seen, to be remembered rightly. Weeks later, the bank released a public statement. It acknowledged Elijah C.K. Kirby as the original founder. It committed to a historical review of its records, and it announced that the main conference room would be renamed in his honor. But for Elijah, the real justice had already come. Not from a plaque, not from headlines, but from that single moment when someone finally looked him in the eye and said, "We believe you." There's a lesson here. Justice may not always be on time. It may take years, even a lifetime. But when it comes, it changes everything. And sometimes it doesn't come riding in with fury or force. Sometimes it just walks in with quiet dignity and refuses to leave. Because truth never dies. It just waits for the right moment, for the right witness, for the right room. And on that cold afternoon in a quiet bank lobby, it finally arrived. Elijah Kirby did not return to the bank the next day. He didn't need to, because he had done what no one else had dared to do for over half a century. He forced an entire community to remember something they had tried to forget. Not through anger, not through threats, but through truth and persistence. Maybe he didn't change the world, but he changed one small corner of it, and sometimes just one corner changing is enough to start something bigger. So what about you? Have you ever witnessed something wrong but stayed silent because you felt too small to make a difference? Remember, Elijah's story isn't just about the past. It's a reminder that justice doesn't have to arrive on time, but it always needs someone to open the door for it to walk through. If this story left you speechless for a moment, if it made you think about what's right in today's world, share this video. Send it to a friend. Be the first to say, "I believe you," even if it's just once.